Gary Cunningham, of course, went to Cistercian and then proceeded to design several of our buildings. And I think he too is a genius in his own right. I think that this room is a great example of that. You know, what was a science center lecture hall that we tried to use for drama productions, that he was found a way to make into a theater. And you can still see where the carpeted steps used to be for this sort of terrace, and the ability to take a walkway and make it into a lobby and add for us a balcony and make a theater space out of what was a science lecture hall is just a little sample of the greatness that he's come up with over the years. They're both going to talk about their own journeys in some sense as well, because they knew O'Neill when they were young men, and not that they're both old now, you know, but he formed them in some ways, and their own journey as artist and architect, and how they were formed by the spaces and the circumstances of their own lives.
Thank you. So it's great to be here. Like you guys, I'm a Cistercian student. I still am. And I was privileged to go to school here from 4th grade through English high school. In fact, started out on the Walnut Hill campus and moved over here in first form. Back then they had 3 forms. And as Lyle mentioned, you know, spending 9 years here, I didn't realize until much later in life how phenomenal, what a tremendous influence spending time around the monks, the lay teachers, and this campus and this place has influenced my life and influenced how I consider things, how I look at things. And I think that someday, if you don't already know, y'all are a much smarter group than we were back then, that this is a very important time in your life, and the things you're learning around and learning within will have staying power with you for all your life. Of course, you know, after I left Cistercian, I went to UT in Austin, and I came across O'Neill Ford. I didn't realize he'd done this campus at the time, to be honest. He was a visiting teacher, and we used to visit his office in San Antonio, and really liked him because he liked young students, and he was always chatting and talking, telling us war stories. He was a character, as Lyle says. Didn't like the establishment that much, and was always kind of causing trouble. He would purposely fall asleep during meetings, and just doodle and just ignore people. Kind of a contrarian, very much a contrarian. But as Lyle mentioned, he had instilled in us as a teacher, even though it was a short time in college, what I had learned here, and that was to really look around, understand, and question everything that you run into. Don't assume anything. So, you know, looking at the environment, looking at nature, how do we begin to communicate with nature and move on and work within it? And in my field is architecture. Now, over 20 years ago, which would have been, you know, something like 15 or 20 years ago, after I left Cistercian, I was approached by some alumni here, the class of '74, who had planned to help raise money to build a chapel for the Abbey. And they kind of asked if I was interested in the project. I said, of course. And so they sent me over to see Father Abbot Dennis, who had to kind of flush me out, check me out, make sure I wasn't too crazy. And I met with his approval. He asked me to do the project as well. And so, you know, we began to design the chapel. And, you know, we were given this amazing abbey, and even though it's rendered in a very modernist flavor from the 1950s and 60s by the original architects, it was laid out very much identical to an abbey you would find in France or Italy or Austria back in the 11th or 12th century. They had the refectory where people ate on the south end, a U-shaped building with a courtyard, and then a church to the north. And usually to the north of that was where the cemetery was. So we had a really nice kind of setup here. So we started getting in on this project, and we actually kind of hit a road bump. We were not getting very far in the design process. And look, when you sit down to design a building, you just don't start drawing pretty pictures. You have to understand what you're doing. And you have to understand it at multiple levels. Obviously, you have parameters like zoning, how high can I build, how much is it going to cost, how am I going to get the work done here, what are the windows going to look like, how is it going to function. So, you know, at that time, Father Abbot decided we should go visit Europe for a couple of weeks. So I got on the phone with Father, and we found ourselves in a lot of environments like this, which is quite a beautiful setting of watching old friends who hadn't seen each other maybe for 4 or 5 years reconnect and talk. And I was kind of enveloped in this culture of the monks and the quietness of it, and the idea of education and academia. And that's contrasted by this very strange picture over here of a guy holding a Budweiser in the middle of Texas in a place called Garden City. So I come back from this visit, and I have an idea in my head of what needs to happen in this project. And the idea is not about a specific building design or what it should look like or how it should feel. It's about how important these people were that I had taken for granted all my life with my teachers. And I realized that the Cistercian order is going to be here for another 1,000 years. It's 900 years old. They're 900 years old now. It's going to survive a long time because all of these men who are part of this order, they don't sit on their butts. They read, they write, they communicate, they teach. They are living, breathing, functioning, brilliant people. And I realized that they're going to stay strong. In a time, back then, people questioned the strength and longevity of a lot of religious orders. I'm convinced that the Cistercians, because of people like you, they're going to be here because they have a job, a very important job. So I felt I better do a good job. This building needs to last a long, long time. Well, that's coming from a guy who grew up in Dallas, who worked in a firm in Dallas, who built buildings that were supposed to last 10 or 20 years maybe. As you know, in Dallas, sometimes, or in America, we build a building and after 15 years, we either tear off the skin or tear it down and build another building in its place, tear down a house, put a new house in its place. That's not the way, for example, European culture works. As you know, people reuse things over and over again. But the fact that I knew the order was going to be here for a long time, I had to figure out a building that was going to survive a long time. So at the same time, we were approached by a grandparent in the school, Lynn Northrop, who offered to let us use stone from his quarry in Garden City, Texas, near Midland, Odessa. And I flew up there and met this man, Connie Edwards, who was actually a mercenary pilot. The guy who collects airplanes. He has about 50 World War II airplanes, Spitfires and Mustangs, and he has the biggest stash of Russian vodka in the world. He, at the time, he thought that you're only going to be able to buy vodka, so he bought all the vodka and put it in his station. This is kind of this crazy guy that had a good time doing his thing. But two very opposing cultures and very opposing images, but they came together in a very lovely, way to make this project happen. And so part of my job is to not let opportunities like this or like this pass me by. And I was supposed to go to Europe to learn about buildings. I went to Europe to learn about the Cistercians. Okay, building part was easy. Understanding what these guys do was much more difficult for me. And when it finally sunk in, it was like a light bulb, like duh. So we start designing a building. And we decide to design a load-bearing wall building like Law's talked about many times, with a simple wooden roof set into it. And working with the stone people, we fashioned a design that involved, 427 of these stones that were 3 foot high, 2 foot deep, and 6 foot long. Each weighing close to 2.5 tons, which were the same size, same weight of the stones at the Great Pyramid of Khufu. So, we were even then talking about how these stones compare in history, what are we doing and how are we doing it that's different, but are we still following the original tenets of building strong, long-lasting structures? So, during the visit to the quarry, I saw this, and this is how they were quarrying stone at the time, back in 1990, 1991, whatever. And you can see, looking at the scale of the people here, these big slots in the ground, about maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches wide, cut by a very big round saw that looks like a skill saw with mean teeth that cut the stone, very rough, and it makes a lot of noise and blows a lot of dust up and so forth. And then they would take the blocks out and they haul the blocks to Dallas or wherever, San Antonio, Houston. They put them on a big machine and cut the stone into thin slivers, maybe 2 inches thick. And then they take the stone to the job site and put the stone up on the wall, maybe against concrete block, and that becomes a stone building. Well, we asked, can we reconsider this approach and not do what's called a stone veneer church, but do a church made out of stones, which everyone's kind of going, wow, we don't do that anymore, do we? So, but we talked them into buying a different saw And they were going into, this building was the first building using the stone, so they were buying machinery, they were gearing up for this new business. And so we made them buy this rather expensive machine, probably cost $250,000. Ironically out of France. It was this big white box that we sat on 2 railroad tracks, and this blade is a 9-foot piece of steel that has a red rubber belt on it like a chainsaw that's out of red rubber. And inside the red rubber, there are little horizontal bars of tungsten. And inside the tungsten, they've embedded industrial diamonds. So they would turn the saw on, and the thing would start going down to the stone and cut into it. And then they would turn on the switch, and the thing would start moving about, I think it's something like maybe a foot every 20 minutes. And they'd go sit in the shade and drink their beer. We told them to cut the stone in 6 foot on center this way and 3 foot on center this way. So we ended up with this large grid in the quarry. You can see the grid right there. And notice how beautiful the cuts are. They're very precise. They're not sloppy. They're about maybe 3/4 inch wide. And because you're going to see in the chapel that the surface of the quarry, the ground you walked on, is the stone. So it's not covered by dirt. There's areas that are like this, but there's a lot of areas that is open to the sky. So over the many millions of years, water has eroded away. This was ocean at one time, and made the surface of the stone smooth. So we took this. I mean, they actually put an airbag in the slits. That's a little air pump, and they filled the bag with air, and air would push the massive stone over. You're looking at, probably 7 or 8 tons of stone right there. And this little airbag just knocks it over, almost like a whoopee cushion. They lay the stone down, and they drill it 3 times to make 4 stones out of this 8 or 9 foot stone. You can see the drill marks. You see the drill marks in the chapel itself. That's how we split the stone. Because back then, in the old day, in the Roman time, or even the Grecian time, and even back to Egyptian period, people would drill a hole in the stone, either using a string and a piece of wood with some abrasive. Now we use drills. They used to put in wooden dowels, wet the dowels, so the wood would expand when it wet, and split the stone. We did it much faster. We had a bunch of guys with drills drilling holes in the stone, and literally just the stone just split in half. So we took these stones 9 at a time. One stone would have a smooth surface on it. The rest of them would be all split face on both sides. Haul them to Irving, Texas, and we'd start stacking them. And this is the first stone that went in. This is a young man at the time, Russ Buchanan, who's now an architect with his own firm. He worked for me at the time. In fact, the office was so slow at that time. During the chapel project, I had to fire Russ because I ran out of money. He went on the job the next day as a carpenter making pews. And he got a raise making pews than over being an architect. So it's a very lucrative business, pew making. So these stones were set in 2 months. 2 months ahead of schedule by some concrete block masons. And they simply stacked them up. They got the gist of it and really understood what was going on, kept the stones centered, and it went up very quickly and very simply, and as dumb as you can imagine. And so we ended up with these walls, and then we dropped in, of course, the wood structure, which is rather complicated in its own right. We'll talk about that maybe in the chapel. This is a rather beautiful image, I think, of when we were sandblasting the floor, the simple concrete floor, with the dust filling in, and see the light coming in from the east in the morning. Blinding the space with light. So we finished the chapel, and that was for the Abbey. Although the school uses the chapel was designed to work as part of the Abbey and integral to that. I didn't, then years later the school came back and said, would you design a new library for us on campus? So now my hat changed from architect of the Abbey to architect of the school. Now, we immediately knew, luckily, because of working with the Abbey, the importance of maintaining the quiet and the calm and the landscape and the vegetation around the Abbey. So we imposed on ourselves that a no-build zone, nothing would be built on this hill. This hill is there to keep the 2 places separate and give the monks some peace when you guys are gone, because you do drive them crazy at times. We certainly did. Y'all do a better job than we do. Y'all know much calmer. But we placed the library right here on the edge of the campus. And that was to be the last line of new buildings to be built. Now, looking at this picture, y'all notice we have the gymnasium here, we have the upper school, the middle school, science building. As you know, the roofs of these buildings are made out of tin, galvanized steel, just like O'Neill Ford did over 60 years ago. We just replaced those roofs 4 or 5 years ago. They've lasted a long time. But you notice that the roof on the library is a different kind of metal. Y'all know what kind it is? It's copper. I'm going to ask you later why we did copper there and not the shiny galvanized metal. Now, placing the building was a new game because we had the original buildings by Ford, the gymnasium by Al Salem, who was in the same line, as Lyle mentioned, on the edge of the bluff. Here we have the hill, here we have the big drop down to the floodplain. And then the science building, which was also done by Al Salem, was placed here, many feet off the back of the middle school, which formed a courtyard between the two buildings, which was a good move, I thought. We decided to follow that move and not connect this building to any existing building, but make it freestanding and create new spaces between the library in the middle school and the library and the science building. And these became 2 more courtyards. We also decided to line up the library front covered walk in line with the door to the old central plant, which for many years served the campus, including the Abbey, with hot and cold water to make the buildings warm and cool. Now that had been abandoned, and we were using different systems to heat the buildings now, including, so this was an empty building. We actually built the pews for the church in that building. We decided to turn that into the art school, art building. So we refurbished that building, put a hole in the roof and make the skylight, and connected this up. So we used cues given to us by previous work on the campus, and we responded to those cues, and we made a plan that respected that, and then also tied into existing circumstances that we could reuse as another building. So, you know, a lot of what we do is detect. You connect the dots, it's rather straightforward. Now, stylistically, this building is very much in the spirit of O'Neill Ford because the guy is in my bones. I went to school here, and literally spending 9 years in these buildings gave me a sense of space. I used to look up into the concrete floors from the lower floors of the school, looking up at the wood beams on the second floor, and was always wondering why they were different. And you figure it out over time. One's holding up another floor, other one's holding up a roof, which is not as heavy. But a lot of people in your situation go to schools that have lay-in ceilings, lay-in tile, and there's no reference to structure. As Lyle mentioned, the structure was not honest, it wasn't there, it wasn't expressed. Well, I grew up in that, so for a reason, and I suspect also my teaching here makes me the same kind of architect as O'Neill Ford. So we did a building that took the same brick, which we have here, which is very soft. It's made from Mexico, and I think it's even sun-dried. It's not very strong. Our engineer said you guys cannot really stack 3 layers of brick and expect that to hold the building up. You're going to have to do something else to make the brick strong. So, like Lyle described with the UD projects and the Romans, we took 2 layers of brick, laid them up, and left a gap in the middle of about 4 or 5 inches, and then we put rebar in there, and we poured vertical pieces of concrete every 4 or 5 feet to give it a structural frame inside the wall. So there's a gridwork of concrete in there. And then the rest of the space we put in insulation to make the building more energy efficient. We also decided to do our walkways as plain as we can make them, as straightforward, so we have very simple posts or columns and flat roofs. And they ties into a very simple way into these brick arches here that were done with the science building. The space itself is very straightforward. We wanted to have a room that had a roof sloping in that direction to face into the hill and have a high wall and a lot of light coming in from more the north side, the softer light. We used a certain glass that didn't bring in direct light, so we wanted the room full of light. We also wanted a certain scale of the room that made an individual feel comfortable, along with another 30 or 40 people in there, that still give the space a sense of heroism and importance. And of course, using natural materials like these large, deep blue lamp beams, which are basically 2x6s glued together, little bits of steel, a la O'Neill Ford, with Tectum, which is a very sound-absorbing roof material. Now, our windows here, we decided not to do flat arches, as Lyle described, because my aesthetic is, I can't afford the idea of someone laying up an elegant arch. We don't often get the great bricklayers like Neil used to get in San Antonio, or maybe we're here for the first building. So we decided, in fact, we had concrete out there already, pouring concrete in between the walls. We simply pour simple concrete beams, lintels, hold up the wall above the window so the window doesn't get crushed. So we wanted to express that, and while it's different than what's happening in the original buildings, it's very much in the same spirit, simply move forward maybe another 50 years. Likewise, the arcade to the art building, typically when you see arcades like the one from here to the middle school, you see two columns with the roof. Here we have a single column with the roof coming off the top. The reason that is the dirt here is very difficult to work in. It's very expansive. When it gets wet, it grows. You also know it gets slippery because it's clay. The cost of each one of those piers going down to the rock is very expensive. So we decided to do a single column with one pier and make the column big enough to cantilever the roof over and avoid the cost of the additional column and additional pier. Again, using common sense, using physics, gravity to help design this thing and work in hand with the idea of the budget and also the idea of aesthetic simplicity and straightforwardness. We went on to do the gymnasium. And of course, this building, and of course, also luckily to get to work on renovation of the original middle and upper school, which I'm very proud of. They feel really good. And it's great to see those buildings that are now 60 years old. They're going to go another 50 or 60 years before you have to think about it again, I hope. So that's very special that these buildings are still here. Now, we have one more building left, I think, in my lifetime, maybe yours, Father Bernard. And that's our last project on the campus. And that is what we call the Keystone Building, and that goes in the space between the middle and upper school. We hope to start that project maybe a year from this next summer. So some of you will see it, some of you may not. But one of the interesting things is, as Lyle mentioned, this building, this building is set into a hill. The upper level, you come in upper level and exit the bottom level. And when we get outside, we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of the land here and the ground, and how the rain over time is going to affect how this campus may be used and how we even access it. And as you can see, we're sitting right here in this theater, and there's the library, and here's the middle school, upper school, and that's the new wing there, jutting out a little bit. And just like the courtyard that happens over here between the middle school and the library, we'll see a new reconfigured courtyard here, and even a little bit over here, that is going to be in the same vein as this courtyard. It's more urban, more ground plane to walk on, less grass to water, more native plants. That's been another strong movement on the part of the school to save energy and save water. They cost money, and they also take away resources. So the native planting saves water. The energy, we put in more insulation on the roofs. We now have 12% less energy bill than we used to have several years ago on the campus. So those are exciting goals that take place alongside of doing things like buildings and designing such stuff. I'm going to jump quickly across the highway and talk about Lyle's building, the art school, which this is a building that Lyle was first involved in when it was first built, another edition, and then another edition for ceramics. We were asked in the late 90s, after our Cistercian library, to add some buildings for the art school expansion. And it's in honor of Miss Harry, because she gave the money for it. So the figures of important patrons in our lives continue to give us great gifts forever. And likewise, there we had our challenges. The ground over there is even worse than the ground over here. It heaves and moves constantly. In fact, a lot of buildings on campus, the ground is moved up underneath the building in the crawl space and literally crushed the ductwork against the floor because the ground simply grows and doesn't go back. In fact, over there, for a while, students that were in trouble, they had to go under the buildings and dig out the dirt during summer. So y'all are pretty lucky. You don't have to do that kind of stuff here. You just get popped on the head with fingernails like I used to do. But we decided to simply raise the buildings up off the ground like bridges, so that these buildings literally float on the ground, you don't touch the earth, and it allowed us to connect everything in these horizontal walkways to give easy flow from building to building, also make it accessible. We also used a very simple building system, which is a prefabricated metal warehouse. Y'all have seen these, different warehouses, Home Depots and things like that, old ones. And this is a school that uses these very humble materials systems, but again, it worked. It was copacetic with the budget. And at the same time, while this is very cost effective, we were able to put very glamorous, expensive material on the skin because copper at the time was at a 50-year low in the marketplace. So we're also watching the stock market Copper's cheap right now. Let's put this thing, let's ask the contractor if I send copper. It came in on budget. So we have a copper building that copper will last, forever. So again, using humble means, but using our brains and using, our experiences, we are able to do a simple thing that even though it's a warehouse structure, it totally fits the character of UD in the art school. And it also, again, expresses its honesty within the structure. In the last slide, this is the front door to the School of Art at UD. It's not a building, it's not a doorway, it's not a fancy gate, it's a simple walk going into the forest. Because the forest has a lot of importance here. A lot of trees were not there when that school was started many 50 years ago. People like Lyle went out there and planted them and kept them alive. And now this is living in a beautiful forest because of people like Lyle and other school that let that happen. For me, that is what's wonderful about this particular school, that you exist within literally a series of tree houses in the forest. Let's take a walk.